Mike will get us going in the text next week. So we here at the church believe in what is called the literal, historical, grammatical interpretation of Scripture. I think that's pretty common. So, but I like to add one more C-A-L word. Geographical interpretation of Scripture. The Bible has 2,000 cities listed in it. Did you know that? And unlike all the other holy books, which are a bunch of junk and parables and mystical stuff, God acted in time, space, and history in real locations, okay? And so I think geography is a great tool in helping us understand the text and especially the context, okay? If you were going to study the book of Philippians, where would you start other than chapter 1? Acts 16. If you were going to study 1 Thessalonians, where would you go? Acts. There you go. With the epistles, Paul's letters especially, you go to the book of Acts because they fall in a historical point in time within the book of Acts when he's on trips and he is writing these letters from certain places, okay? So this all takes place in the Roman world. This is kind of, from what, 50 or 60 BC all the way to 14 AD, and then 115 AD, you can see the expanse of the Roman Empire. And I was in Spain, less than 2 weeks ago, walking around right next to Roman walls. Did you know that? In Leon, Spain, and in Britain, you can visit Roman ruins in England because the empire had, stretched so far. So Paul, we're looking here about 51 AD. Okay, so Rome has now taken over the Greek Empire, the Greco-Roman Empire. So you have a little bit of, the idols from both ages, the Greek idols, the Greek gods, the Roman gods, and their architecture. Okay? So when I was growing up and going to Sunday school, I thought all the Bible characters were in the desert with sandals, wearing robes. Because we had flannel graph. Y'all don't know what flannel graph is, do you? It was these little pasted people you stuck on a little cloth board, and the teacher would move them around. And I didn't realize really till I was probably much older, in my 30s, that there was a real world, with libraries and architecture and, outside of world history, I wasn't connecting the dots. The Bible was just this ancient thing, and Abraham was a guy in the desert that didn't know much. Whoa, far from the truth. This was a very sophisticated world, and the Roman Empire was stretching, obviously. Rome, I don't know, has anybody been there? Anybody been to Rome? It's just an amazing, the architecture of the Caesars and all of them, all the way to Titus, and incredible. Their amphitheaters, their libraries, their Senate, they had their White House, their Capitol buildings, and all that stuff. It was an amazing thing. Of course, just right after Paul, maybe 10, 20 years later, then, the Colosseum was completed. And that was, you could tell the kind of architecture that Paul was familiar with in the ancient world. This was a hippodrome. It would seat 150,000 people on concrete seats for horse races. Incredible, okay? And on it goes. You can just Google Rome, ancient Rome, and you got it. By the way, I visited the most complete Roman Colosseum that's not been destroyed. It's been preserved. You know where it was? In Tunisia, North Africa. Because the Roman Empire was a Mediterranean. Everybody thinks Europe. No, it was a Mediterranean empire. Hint, hint, that might have something to do with prophecy. But anyway, back here with 1 Thessalonians. In Tunisia, you can look it up. There is an incredible preserved Roman Colosseum, all right, because they had crossed over into North Africa as well, okay? So this is the world of Paul. Certainly, I'm not going to do what MacArthur did, right? When he did the preaching on the book of Romans, he said, what's the first word in the book of Romans? Paul. And he spent like 3 weeks on Paul. But obviously, this was his world. He was familiar with the Jewish world, the Jewish context, the rabbis, as well as the secular world. He could move in and out very, very well, which is pretty neat. We should probably do the same, right? Know our surroundings. So this is the first missionary journey. In the back of your books, you have the 67th book of the Bible, which is the book of maps, okay? And they're there for a reason. Almost every Bible has the journeys of Paul back there. So basically, on Paul's first missionary journey, we're looking at the late 40s, okay? And he leaves Antioch, and I'm going to show you some pictures, and he goes to the region of Pamphylia and then up to Antioch. There's 2 Antiochs, one in Syria and one in Pisidia, and then on to Iconium, Lystra, Derbe, and back home. So he was beginning to plant churches. By the way, this is what country today? Turkey. Okay? So if you go on an ancient church tour, you're basically in Turkey the whole time. Okay? Ephesus, 7 churches of Asia, in the book of Revelation, they're all in Turkey. All right? So this was Paul's first missionary journey. And he set off from Antioch of Syria, which is right, today it would be Lebanon, okay? And right here on the Orontes River, where it empties into the sea, he would set sail on a couple journeys from this location out into the Mediterranean. And this is the Orontes River as it runs down to the ocean. This is pretty neat here. This is a grotto, which is really a fancy name for a carved out cave in the side of a hill or a rock. And in the first century, there were about 20 of these caves. Early churches met in them. This particular one, tradition says, is where Paul met and Timothy, and where this church sent out the guys on their missionary journeys, okay? It's called St. Peter's Grotto Church of Antioch. You can see over the years this front on it. But the Christians in Paul's time had to do what? Hide. We don't tend to read the New Testament under persecution, but almost every letter should be read under persecution. Okay? Same with 1 Thessalonians. This is the inside of St. Peter's Grotto. And then Titus had built tunnels here. The Greeks and Romans. This was a very important port on the northeast side of the Mediterranean where they embarked from. So that's Paul's first missionary journey. The main thing was to start churches here. Okay? So a few years go by, and here's some pictures of Antioch, Pisidian. You can see they're in the Cappadocious hills, and there's some ancient ruins. Man, Rome had huge temples in these cities, okay? And you can see, look at the size of these. And that was later on top of the synagogue was built these Roman temples. They were huge, so Paul would have seen this stuff, all right? And the Cardo, which is the pavement, the road would go through and on to the rest of Europe. And it would have big columns and then markets, like the mall on the side of the street. So these highways were avenues of preaching the gospel, okay? And then they went to Iconium. This is mentioned several times in Scripture. We don't have to read all those, but Paul and Barnabas traveled here. So this is Iconium today, but it was smaller, but it was still, still a bustling city. This is Lystra. There's been a lot of archaeology done there, but none of the ruins are left. You can see the word Lystra here. They found the word Lystra on a thing. So Lystra is famous for, who did Paul meet there? Timothy. That's where he first met Timothy, at Lystra. Okay, this is Derbe, the remains of Derbe. There's a name there. Okay, so that's the first missionary journey of Paul. Now, there's a Jerusalem council following this. What do we do with the Gentiles, circumcision, all those kind of things? And then what do they have to do? What's Paul now concerned with, do you think? Going back to those churches. He's going to go back and check them out, see how they're doing, and then he'll go further, even beyond those churches that were originally started. So, on his second missionary journey, they begin in Jerusalem, go to Antioch, and then they go to his hometown, Tarsus. And then they revisit these cities. See, Derbe, Lystra, Iconium, Antioch. So they revisit these cities, and then they take the gospel even further. Okay? So when you're reading in the book of Acts, they visited these, strengthening the saints and, appointing elders and all those kind of things. By the way, this is the original arch that led into Paul's hometown. So, he wasn't just, a country bumpkin. He had a lot of class, education, of course, we know. And these are some of the pavements, the street. And you can see the columns and all. This is Tarsus. Check this out. I thought this was interesting. These are the manholes. You wouldn't think. And these are the sewers, the water, the sewer system at Tarsus. I would have never thought that, would you? I thought, he's from Tarsus, some little town in the country. No, this was a very, they had libraries and all these temples and all of that. So these are the housing. Maybe Paul lived. I think Paul lived in that one right there. No. But the remains of houses that surrounded the city and in the excavations there. So let's read here Acts 16. You can follow in your Bible here, but here's something. When you read the book of Acts, you should have a map. You should have a map and a pencil. You will be blown away by how much travel goes on in the book of Acts. It is amazing the amount of territory that's covered and what Paul himself covers with no airplane and automobile. I mean, it's really amazing. When I teach a geography class, sometimes we'll just do that in the book of Acts. We'll just start reading cities, and we get tired just reading the cities. That's a lot. So, in verse 1 of chapter 16, Paul came also to Derbe and to Lystra, and a disciple was there named Timothy. He was well spoken of by the brethren who were at Lystra and Iconium. We just saw those places on the first journey, right? So now Paul wanted this man to go with him. It's on his second journey now. He's in Lystra, and he finds Timothy. And verse 4, now while they were passing through the cities, they were delivering decrees which had been decided upon by the apostles and elders who were in Jerusalem. That was the council, okay? Here's the ruling from the church in Jerusalem regarding circumcision, Jews, Gentiles in the same body, all those kind of things, all right? Because that was a big deal. Verse 5, so the churches were being strengthened in the faith, and more were increasing. They were increasing in number. So that's good. Since 2-3 years ago, now they strengthen them, and the numbers are increasing, okay? So that's really good in the book of Acts, okay? They passed through, you probably didn't realize I call it spiritual gymnastics. When you read the text and you hit all these names of places, you kind of jump over them, the hurdle. Ooh, where are all these places? Well, now you know. They passed through Phrygian and Galatia regions. Now, this is pretty interesting. Having been forbidden by the Holy Spirit to go to Asia, to speak the word in Asia. Okay, you remember, they're coming up to the coast, and they're going to go this way to Asia, and the Holy Spirit says no. That is very, very unusual. Okay? So then they're going to turn left, and they're going to go to Bithynia, and the Spirit of Jesus, by the way, that's a Trinity there, isn't it? Okay, the Spirit of Jesus did not permit them. We can't go right or we can't go left. Now, is this how we should seek guidance from Christ and the Spirit today? No. Okay? Not at all. Acts is descriptive, it's not prescriptive. Okay? There are roughly 90 major decisions in the book of Acts. Do you know how many times Paul or anyone was told what to do by God? 3. Did you know that? These 2, and at the end of the book, Abacus says if you go to Jerusalem, you're going to be bound. That's it. So don't think that in the book of Acts, just God is whispering, Paul go left, Paul go right, Timothy do this. No, they're living like we are by faith. It was very, very rare to have a word from God like this, okay? It is not prescriptive. This is descriptive. It's a unique period of time where the gospel is going to go for the first time into Europe. So you can't go right, you can't go left, you're going to go straight north and cross the Aegean Sea and preach the gospel in Europe. Because when you cross the Aegean Sea, you've left Asia, and now you're in Europe. Okay? So, in passing by Mysia, they came down to Troas. Troas is the little town, not little, it was a port city on the Aegean Sea. Okay? And a vision appeared to Paul in the night. This is one of those 3 times that they're told what to do here. And was standing, there was a man of Macedonia standing and appealing to him, saying, come over, this is a vision, come over to Macedonia and help us, bring us the word of God. All right? And when he had seen the vision, notice this pronoun. Immediately, we sought to go to Macedonia, concluding that God had called us to preach the gospel to them. What just happened? First of all, who's on the journey? Paul. Do you remember who else is with him? Silas. They had left Barnabas over to go to Crete. And Timothy. Who would the 4th person be? Who's the we? Who wrote the book of Acts? Luke. So you got the mission dream team. You've got Luke, Paul, Silas, and Timothy. And they're just dribbling the gospel, hitting 3s all day long. All right? The mission dream team. What if the 4 of them came into town, huh? They do what we do, preach the word of God. Okay? So, Luke is with them. So now you have the 4 who are traveling, and they're going to cross over. And from Troas, we ran a straight course to this island called Samothrace, and the day following to Neapolis, and from there to Philippi, which is the leading city of Macedonia, a Roman colony, and we stayed there for some time, some days. You got it? Well, let's look at it. Okay. So, Paul and Silas, after the Jerusalem Council, they go to Troas and through the regions here, and then to Lystra, pick up Timothy. Now, do you see the 3rd line? They pick up Timothy. They are forbidden to go to Bithynia, and they are forbidden to go to Mysia here. So they can't go right or left. They go to Troas, and from there they go to this island, Samothrace, and they cross over to Neapolis. So this highway here is very important. Does anybody know what the name of that highway is? the Ignatia Way. It connected Europe, all right, all the way over here, and you could cross into Asia. So they are like on Highway 60, all right? When they land in Neapolis and they get off the boat and they can start preaching right there. And you see how close Philippi is? Look, right there, okay? So when they go down the road just a few miles to Philippi and plant a church, it's the, you guessed it, First Baptist Church of Philippi. Or we would say the First Baptist Church of Europe. It's the first church of Europe. All right. And we're headed to Thessalonica. All right. These are the remains at Troas. Paul left, remember he wanted his books dropped off there. Remember that? So he was here a few times. And then from there, they crossed over to Samothrace, and then they landed at this place called Neapolis, where they got off the boat and got onto the Ignatia Highway, okay? So here's what it looks like. The four of them cross over, and then they're on the Ignatia Way. This is a typical Roman road through that area. Sometimes it got really wide and had columns and all. The closer you got to cities, like our highways. The closer you get to a city, the more stuff is on it, okay? And I always like to show this picture. They had rest stops too, okay? I just try to make it real. It's the real people, real time, space, and history with real needs, okay? So that's the rest stop along the Ignatia Way, which led to Philippi. And I've actually stood right there where the highway would come into Philippi, okay? And this is the remains of Philippi. Can you imagine this? Are you trying to I want you to be Paul as we go through 1 Thessalonians, okay? He was in these places. He knew them, all right? And he spent time in jail. When you visit Philippi, they say this is the traditional jail spot. Who knows? But probably something like that, where Paul and Silas, remember, they were beaten at Philippi. And look at the remains of this area. I mean, the colonnades and all that, the temples, the malls. I mean, hey, Mom, Dad, I'm going to the mall. Yeah, even back then, and the libraries. Incredible. I mean, the whole place is huge. I can't remember how many acres, probably a couple hundred acres. Amazing sight. And you can walk all over it. And then down by the river, they met a lady named Lydia, gave her the gospel, and there you got the first church, right? How would you like the first three members of your church to be a merchant lady, a sorcerer, remember the girl that they cast the demon out of, and the jailer, the warden. Remember he got saved? The night the earthquake shook? All right? So, shook the prison. And so that was the beginning of the church at Philippi. And so then he moves on. Okay, these are some remains. I can just imagine what these tall columns with the roofs, how beautiful that must have been. Okay? Huge, huge area, Philippi. Look at that. And by the way, whenever you're studying a passage, Google it. You get the most updated pictures, because archaeology is going on all the time in these places. Look at this at Philippi, the theater or amphitheater. Okay? So we pick it up in verse 17. Are you with me now? Are you with Paul? You cross over, the four of them, you go to Philippi. Now, Luke stays at Philippi, and then Paul, Silas, and Timothy, they move on from Philippi, and they're going down this major highway called the Ignatia Way, all right? So now we hit chapter 17. By the way, the rest of chapter 16 is what? The events at Philippi. But if we were studying Philippians, we just stop and do all that. But now we jump over the events at Philippi, And we go to verse 1 of chapter 17. And when they had traveled through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to the book we're going to study, the city behind it, Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews. You know, he would always go seek out the Jews in the synagogue first. And according to Paul's custom, he went to them, and for 3 Sabbaths, 3 weeks, he reasoned with them from geology, philosophy, no, evidence, no. What did he reason with them? From the scriptures. So they knew, oh, this guy knows his scriptures. And the Bereans, they could even check him out. He's right. The things they are saying fulfill what we've read in the Old Testament, in our scriptures, okay? Because, by the way, up to this point, maybe only Galatians has been written. Okay? So, and explaining, giving evidence that Christ had to suffer and rise again from the dead, there's the gospel, saying, this Jesus whom I'm proclaiming to you is the Messiah, the Christ. And some of them were persuaded. So now you have the Second Baptist Church of Europe. Of Europe, right? Or even Macedonia. But the Jews, now here's where it gets interesting. The Jews becoming jealous. This guy, we had 100 people at synagogue. And last week, Paul came into town, we only have 60 in synagogue. You see? Turf war. They're believing the gospel, they're leaving the synagogue, and they're saying, hey, what Paul's preaching is right. It's the truth. It's the gospel that saves, okay? So the Jews were jealous and taking along some wicked men from the marketplace. So just like riots today, right? You go to the marketplace, you get a few people that will side with you, come and help us. And they formed a mob and set the city in an uproar. Man, this would have been on CNN and Fox, you know? Same thing. Okay, but this time it's over the gospel. And attacking the house of Jason, they were seeking to bring them, Paul, Silas, Timothy, out to the people. So they're staying at Jason's house, and Jason's house is attacked. Bring them out. These guys that are causing an uproar in our city. Now that's a lie. You know, of course, that just wasn't true. They were sheep stealing, maybe, but for the right reason. Okay? So here's what's happened so far. So they've gone from Troas to Neapolis and then up to Philippi. They passed through these 2 cities, Amphipolis and Apollonia, and they came to Thessalonica. All right? Today, this is Greece, by the way. Today, this is Greece. All right? So this is just the remains of one wall in Apollonia. Or Amphipolis, sorry. These are the kind of cities along that highway. All right? So when this crowd, this mob, could not find Paul, Silas, and Timothy, they began dragging Jason and other of the believers. How old are these believers? Days. They're already being persecuted. And they shouted, these men have upset the world. Now, is that a slight exaggeration? All right? And they've come here also. Well, I'm sure there was some news about Paul, but this is really exaggerated. And Jason has welcomed them, that traitor. He's hiding those guys, all right? And they all act contrary to the decrees of Caesar. Isn't that amazing? The Jews are appealing to the laws of Caesar. You know, sin makes you just stupid. It just does. You're irrational, okay? And so they said, there's another king, Jesus. Now, by the way, Jesus has died, been raised, and ascended to heaven only 20 years earlier than this. Okay? So the word's out. Jews who had been traveling. They knew the story. You know, there were earthquakes and things. There were some signs. And some people are believing. And it's upsetting the Jewish leaders, okay? So the brethren immediately sent Paul and Silas away by night to Berea. So here's what they do. They find Paul and Silas, and they said, hey, you got to get out of town. You're dead ducks, okay? So they said, okay, we'll go. All right. Now, one thing you got to remember, Paul and Silas had been beaten in Philippi. They go 30 miles down the road to Thessalonica. This is not in the text. It's just my hunch. My hunch is some of these new believers probably helped put bandages on the sores on their back. They knew that these guys have been whipped for the gospel. They're not joking around. I mean, this stuff is all boom, 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 okay? So they leave Thessalonica and they go to Berea. And when they had arrived, they went into the synagogue in Berea. Okay, are you on the trip yet? Are you on the trip? Any questions? All right. So, just a few pictures. This is the arch at Thessalonica. Paul would have seen this. Okay. These are remains. Now, some of these remains, this temple, this Roman temple here is 2nd century, but it's only 150 years after Paul, so you get the idea. It was a pretty elaborate city. Okay. By the way, these buildings here go back to like 1000 BC. No, I'm just kidding. It's amazing. You wonder what they built on top. Okay. This is going to remind me of a story. I stood on this street over here one day, probably about 8 years ago, and it was really hustle bustle, and this guy that was driving the bus for us, he was a believer, and I was just looking at this whole Muslim world, slash European, just kind of mostly Muslim, and I said, man. He was Greek. We were in Greece. It was Greek, but there's a lot of Muslims who've come from Iraq, Iran, because Greece is the beachhead for them to get into Europe. A lot of human trafficking. It's just terrible, like our border. But anyway, so I asked him, I said, the Greeks, your people, they just don't even care about the gospel. It's totally secular. They can't stand religion, and just, you know what he said? I'll never forget it as long as I live. He said, yeah, you know what? It's terrible about my people, but you know who's getting saved? I said, no. He goes, it's the Muslims who are getting saved. Because when they come to Europe, they're totally bankrupt. They don't have anything. And I've seen them going through the garbage cans in Athens. Refugees from Iraq and Iran. Okay? He goes, they're the ones getting saved. I said, man, we don't know diddly squat of what God is doing around the world, So, anyway, God was saving people then. He's saving people now. All right? So these are some of the remains. The art. You could see, man, their colonnades, the markets were inside of these little arches and stuff. Incredible world of the Apostle Paul, okay? In 160, you got to remember, these cities were started by Philip of Alexandria, Alexander the Great, and then they became Roman cities. So in 146, I mean, this city's already 200 years old by the time Paul gets there. All right? So you can see what's happened. Different kind of a map. Troas to Neapolis, Philippi to Thessalonica. Paul and Silas go to Berea. Timothy, the white line, follows a little bit later. And then the Jews, they don't just kick him out of town. They follow him from Thessalonica to Berea. That's like somebody kicking you out of Tampa and you go to Orlando and they follow you there trying to get you. Okay? That's how upset they were with these guys. So while they're in Berea, do you remember what it said about the Bereans? They really searched the scripture to make sure these things were true. Well, now you know how we got to Berea. Well, in Berea, the brothers said, you know what? You need to move on again. You need to go to Athens. So Paul takes the boat, and he takes it all the way down the coast. We were able, on a trip I was on, we drove down this coast, but he was out in the water on a ship. And he came to Athens, okay? All right, so here's the Athens harbor. Of course, you probably, if you study world history, you know a lot about Athens. Huge, huge place. The Acropolis with the Parthenon on the top. This thing was old when Paul got there, and it was complete. It had Roman deities in it. It had Greek gods in it. And, it was just crazy. Crazy how big that thing is, too. You can see it from an aerial view. Now, you wonder where it all went. In 1680s, there were people storing stuff in there, and it got hit with a rocket and bombed it out. And then in the 1880s, 200 years later, there was another missile hit it. There was Muslims controlling it, and it blew up. They were storing gunpowder in it, bang, bang. And that's where you can read the history of it there, how it got wrecked, Okay? So Paul would have been here. And by the way, Paul didn't stay long in Athens. He didn't like it. There were no converts, all the philosophers. You remember he goes to Mars Hills and argues with them? He's like, these people are knuckleheads. I want out of here. Okay? I'm ad-libbing to Paul, but he did. He said, this was tough. I have no fruit. Athens was tough, okay? So Paul is in Athens. This is important. He's by himself. What do? You got to send a text to Timothy and Silas at Berea. Come visit me. I'm lonely. So Paul's in his apartment in Athens, and he's lonely. All right? And his spirit was stirred in him when he saw the whole city given to idolatry. This was not pleasant for Paul, okay? So Paul stood in the midst of Mars Hill, and he said, you men of Athens, I perceive that all things to you are superstitious. You remember his whole argument there with the philosophers on Mars Hill. So I remember standing on that and reading the passages. It's really pretty cool. Okay? So from Athens, Paul sends Silas. This is where we're coming down to Thessalonica here. Paul sends a word to Berea, and he says, Timothy and Silas, please come see me. All right? So they do, and Paul moves from there over to Corinth, okay? I'm going to put it all together in a map for you. Here's some pictures of Corinth, some of the remains at Corinth. Huge archaeological seat. This is the Bema seat, by the way. Paul talks about the Bema seat, where he was brought by the Jews before the Roman judges, okay? Look at those streets in Corinth. This was the world of Paul's, what I'm trying to get you to see, the world of Paul. By the way, this temple was 600 years old when Paul got there. That Greek temple in Corinth. That's amazing, isn't it? Okay? I'm sorry, I lied. 700 years old by Paul's time. Okay? There's the Bema seat, which means platform on which the Roman officials stood. And then in Corinth, Paul was hauled before the Roman proconsul by the members of the irate members of the synagogue. You know what this is? There was a god, the goddess Asclepios, who would heal. So if you had something wrong with your body, like an arm or a leg or whatever, you'd make a ceramic thing and bring it to this goddess, and maybe it would heal that part of your body. This is what was going on in Corinth. This is the world of Paul. And the reason I want you to see that is because at the end of Thessalonians, how are the believers described? Those who gave up their idols to serve the one and true living God. Okay? So now when we read Thessalonians, we can be kind of like the Thessalonians in that world, okay? So here's what's happened so far. The 4 of them went to Neapolis and then to Philippi. The 3 of them went on down the road to Thessalonica. Paul and Silas went to Berea. Timothy followed them later. And then the Jews were after them still. So Paul goes to Athens. You're wondering, what does this have to do with Thessalonica? I'll show you. And so then he sends word back to Berea, Silas and Timothy, come visit me. All right? And they do. But now what does Paul think? I know we call him the Apostle Paul, but he's Pastor Paul. What do you think is on his mind now? Just guess. Who? The believers in Thessalonica and Philippi. How are they doing? I got kicked out of town and I was beaten. How are those new believers? Ding. These are personal letters. That's all I want you to know tonight. These are extremely personal. How are the believers doing? They beat my back. What about the Smith family? So, how's he going to find out how they're doing? That was pretty good. That was speaking in tongues right there. Okay, now, so what he does is he sends Silas to Philippi. Silas, go check on the saints. See how they're doing. And then he sends Timothy to Thessalonica. Timothy, go check out the saints. How are they doing? You know, when you open the book of 1 Thessalonians, do you know all this is behind the scenes? It's incredible. And so they do. Now, while they're gone, Paul slips over to Corinth. Did you see the little red line? Paul slips over to Corinth. And then the first one to oh no, did I hit the wrong button? I turned it off accidentally. Help me. There it is. Thank you. Okay. Okay, so they chase him down. Then he sends word. They follow him. And then, so he slips over to Corinth. And then Silas returns first. So Paul and Silas are in the apartment one night. Okay? Silas is giving a report on Philippi. We don't have that. But there's a knock on the door. Who do you think it might be? Timothy. Timothy comes back from Thessalonica. And by the way, they were there. Some people say 3 weeks is all that Paul, Silas, and Timothy were in Thessalonica. It could be up to 3 months. In other words, not long. They were in Thessalonica and formed a new church. Timothy comes back with a report. Okay? What do you think that causes? Huh? The letter. Bingo. You got it. That causes the letter. So how do we get 1 Thessalonians? That way. So Paul and Silas are sitting there and there's a knock on the door. Timothy comes in. I got a report from Thessalonica. And we'll see that report next week. They are doing great. By the way, Thessalonians is a model church. Other than some people who didn't want to work for their living, it's a great church. So Timothy starts telling Paul about the saints. Oh, they're doing great. They're trumpeting the gospel. You know, I mean, it's going wonderful. They're under persecution, but they're handling it well, blah, blah, blah. And so what does Paul do? Of course, he gets his laptop and he starts to write a letter. No, he grabs his pen. And so how does the book start? Watch this. Paul and who do you think? What's the next word? Silvanus or Silas and Timothy. The three of them write. Paul writes, but they're looking over his shoulder. So Paul's going, oh, that is so good. Oh, I want to write them. I remember them. He's playing in his mind's video the events of being at Thessalonica, running from Jason, out of Jason's house and all of that. And now it's just a month like 4 months later, he writes the second of his epistles after Galatians. And so he's writing this. And I can just see, now this is not scripture, but I can just see Silas and Timothy looking over his shoulder. And, no, tell them we love them. Say this, say that. Because the three of them, it's their heart. Look at the next. How does verse 2 begin? We give thanks for y'all. So, brothers and sisters, that is how we get the book of 1 Thessalonians. Okay? So, after that, 18 months in Corinth, Paul left and headed back toward Israel, toward Jerusalem, by way of Ephesus. Okay? I've got pictures of Ephesus, but we're over time. Okay? So, that is the background to 1 Thessalonians. And by the way, you could do the same kind of presentation for each of the letters. All right? Because there's a history, there's a connection, geographical, cultural, language, people, events that ties Paul, Silas, Timothy, and Luke to these precious new believers in Macedonia. Okay? So Paul left, went to Ephesus, by the way, blah, 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 where Luke and John are buried. Okay? So if you grew up in Ephesus, maybe the Apostle John was there, baptized you. Luke married you. Paul counseled you. And Timothy buried you. If you were part of a long-time member at Ephesus. That's very possible. Okay? Or, maybe not in that order, but maybe they buried you first and then you got married. No, I don't know. But or either other guys. So, any questions? And I believe, hopefully these maps came out online. I hopefully they did. Yes.
And the modern pictures of the old ruins, are they protected? Like, can anyone just walk through that? Or?
They're protected, yeah. But you can walk through it because you can't really.
But historically, they care? Or
yeah.
Biblically?
Yeah, well, the new generation growing up around there, they don't have a clue what it is. Yeah. But all the tour buses with Christians on it, yeah, they want the money, so they're not going to let it go away. Right. Yeah. So see, in Israel, the Arabs own the shops. That's why they're not going to mess with the Christian sites.
Out of those big areas? Like,
what's that?
How do they keep, teenagers out of those areas?
They don't. They'll run through it. Yeah, I mean, there's like we have monuments, they have the lines and the little chains and all that, but it doesn't protect anything. Two things that's a great point, Caroline. Did y'all hear that? Are these sites protected? Yes, but the Taliban, what did they do in Persia? Remember? They blew up all that stuff, Cyrus's stuff, from the time of Daniel. What, 20 years ago? Yikes. That was really bad. Fortunately, there was a lot of pictures and a lot of stuff had gotten out of there. So, Lisa and I, one time, we were in Prague. Have you ever heard of the guy named John Huss, who was burned at the stake for giving the Bohemian people the Bible in their language? So, there's a big monument where he was burned at the stake. Big as this auditorium. And so we cried when we saw it. I said, let's get my picture. So I went up there and stood amongst the drug addicts and the urine and the feces and everything else on this monument. And Lissa took my picture. They have no clue. You have all these generations. They're looking at where John Huss was burned at the stake. They have no clue. You guys know John Glass? John Glass grew up in Geneva kicking a soccer ball against Calvin's cathedral. Never knew what it was till he went to seminary and learned about it in L.A. And learned who Calvin was. So, generations, look at our war memorials. Young people walk by, do they have a clue? No. So, sorry I went off on that one. But
Maybe that's why in the Old Testament God continually talks to him about memorials.
Memorials are important. Yeah, the stones, right, in the book of Joshua. What are there, 7-something monuments in the book of Joshua? 5, 6, 7 of them. Put these stones here as a reminder. Teach your generation not to forget the mighty acts of God. Yeah. So you can visit Thessalonica. You won't get a, funny chill up your leg or, fuzzy feelings or anything. But it is pretty neat to see where these things happen.
Ephesus is pretty much abandoned. It's very strange because there's not even a big city near it.
Yeah. The bigger city was built closer down near the water.
Silted by,
Yeah.
so it's all, nobody messes with it because it's.
Yeah, look at Durban and Lister. They're just left out there in the wide open,
Wasn't there, where did they race the chariots and that stuff? What do you call Colosseums?
Coliseum.
In Israel as well, Caesarea?
There are hippodromes in Israel, yeah, that the Romans built. Yeah, and Caesarea Maritime, which is the one on the beach. There's a Caesarea Philippi that's up in the north. All right, anything else? Thanks for your patience. I thought I'd be done earlier tonight, but I just got rolling there. So, well, thanks for coming. So now next week when Mike dives into verse 1, you have the setting. You got the background. And then pretend, this week, kind of think about that and think, when I want to go next Wednesday night, I want to be a Thessalonian. I lost my job. I helped put bandages on Paul. I knew my Old Testament. I was a Jew, and he taught me the Old Testament, which pointed to Christ, and I became a believer. And now he's writing me. Whoa. Now, last thing. Think about this. We're on official. We're off church time. We're on Ken time. Okay. Just think about this one thing. You get a text. Well, not a text, but you get a message. Tonight, meet at Sage's house. Paul has written us a letter. So that word goes out to the believers. What are you going to think? Are you going to miss that? Ain't no way. So Sage's house in Thessalonica, it's going to be packed, right? And everybody's going to be sitting around, and then somebody's going to stand up and read the letter. Now, as that letter is being read, you remember the Apostle Paul when you went to go buy a tent or get your tent fixed. You remember him putting his arm around you and leading you to Christ. And now you're listening to a letter he's writing you. And I believe this because, they didn't have copies of the scripture, right? I personally believe that when they read the letter, we need to do that. Start off next week, read the letter. I'll bet you anything, they would probably say, can you read it again? Okay, I know it's getting late. The kids got to be at the Hippodrome tomorrow morning for a race. Can you read it just one more time? That's what I think. All right. Father, thanks for our night. Thanks for your word. You can't make it up. Certainly yours. Help us to glean from it, to appreciate you and the gospel more from it. In Christ's name, amen.